This passage reveals that marriage is something that has been created by God. Back in verse 18, and the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him an help meet for him." And so he made the woman. Look at verse 23, verse 22. "And the rib which the Lord God had taken from man made he a woman, and brought her to the man." Who brought her to the man? God did. God brought that woman. God made that woman. "And for this cause, therefore," in the Old Testament word, "shall a man leave his father and his mother." In other words, we have marriage. We value marriage. We recommend marriage. We consider marriage because God has made it what it is. God made the man and the woman. God brought Eve to the man. By the way, to go back to our dating or courtship illustration, one of the purposes of dating, or courtship if you want to call it that, and we'll formalize it a little differently, is for you to just kind of see if God is actually bringing this person to you or not. I mean, you might date a person for 4 months or 5 months or 2 years or whatever and finally decide, this is not going to be the one that God has brought for me. And by the way, we shouldn't get all upset when you break up in situations like that. Thank God, if it's not the one God wants for you, that God has spared you both from being in a relationship that would be difficult or hard or damage your ability to serve the Lord. Part of that dating relationship is just to see if this is the one God is bringing to my life. But God is the one who makes marriages. Back in Matthew chapter 19, you remember where we read here, Jesus said, "For this cause, because God made them in the beginning, male and female, for this cause shall man leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife." You know what the next thing Jesus said was? Let's look at it again. In verse 6, "Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." Let me ask you this question. Who makes marriages? Who makes a marriage? What does the Bible tell us? God does. God makes marriages. So let's dispel some false thinking here. If God makes marriages, let's understand this. Government does not make marriages. Let me say it again because this is so important for us to understand. Government does not make a person married to his or her spouse. In fact, if we look at Genesis, we'll see that there was a lot of marriage before there was ever any government. Let's just look, I'll just do the exercise here. Adam and Eve were first. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1. Follow with me. Flip the pages. Let's read them together. Genesis chapter 4 and verse 1. It says, "And Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain." Adam and Eve were married. By the way, do you think they went down to the county courthouse and got a license and took it back to be recorded? No, because there wasn't one. Do you think they stood before witnesses and had a preacher say, "Now I pronounce you man and wife"? No. Did they go to the justice of the peace? No. Yet it says Adam knew his wife. They were married in chapter 4 and verse 1. Look at verse 17. Verse 17, "And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch." Now, some might say, well, this is really the first government because you've got a civilization, you've got a city where people are trying to live together and get along, so they probably had some laws and all that. You might see this as the first government. Even if you do take that argument, I still point out Cain was married and Adam was married before ever there's a mention of a city. But I don't think this is the first government, so let's read a little farther on. Look at verse 19. Here's another notorious guy. "And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah." Look at chapter 6 and verse 1. "And it came to pass, when men began to multiply in the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all they chose." Look at chapter 7 and verse 13. "And it came to pass in the 601st year, in the I'm sorry, that's the wrong chapter. Chapter 7, verse 13. The selfsame day entered Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth and the sons of Noah and Noah's wife and the 3 wives of his sons with them into the ark. Chapter 8 and verse 18. And Noah went forth, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. So here's Noah also and his sons being married. Then finally we come to Genesis chapter 10 and verses 8 through 10 where we meet a man by the name of Nimrod. Verse 8, and Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar. This is the first mention of a kingdom. And Nimrod was a king. He was the first king. Okay? What had happened, I'll just kind of give you the overview here. Before the flood, one of the things that appalled God about mankind is how violent they became against each other. I mean, Cain was the first murderer, but after that there was all kinds of violence that happened in those first couple thousand years of man's existence. So man destroys the world with a flood, and afterwards he tells Noah, when he gets off the boat, he says, man's blood is precious to me. If any person spills man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. Now that doesn't mean man as in one person, a vigilante chasing down someone who killed my buddy. What that means is man in general, in the form of a government, saying because you killed somebody else, we as mankind, in the form of a government, demand their blood at your hand. Genesis 9, where God says, by man shall his blood be shed, was the institution of human government. The first man that we see following that was Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. That doesn't mean he went out and he hunted buffalo or elk or deer. That meant that he was a hunter of men. Men who had violated God's law, and he was the one who brought them back to justice. And in doing so, he became the king of a kingdom. That's when government began. But before government began in Genesis chapter 10, there were a lot of people getting married. Now, let's just ask ourselves the question. Well, I'll just answer the question. I want to ask you. Let me just say this. They did not have marriage licenses. They didn't have marriage licenses. Now I have a marriage license. My wife and I were married in Wake County, North Carolina. We did it as the law requested, and we went down and we got our marriage license. We had it filled out by the officiants and the witnesses. We had it recorded, and right now we are legally married in the eyes of the government. But these people didn't. And I want you to understand there's a delusion that we are laboring under in 2013. The delusion is that we need to have a marriage license in order to be married. Are you following me? In other words, we need to have a license from the government in order for our marriage to be valid. Is that what you think what the Bible teaches? It doesn't teach that at all. In fact, here's the truth of it. The reality is, government has only recently been involved in the business of licensing marriages. Up until the 1800s in England, in order to get married, you know what you had to do? You had to post for 2 weeks in your local church parish. You had to post that you plan to get married. And that gave people 2 weeks to object if they thought you could not be married. And then if you did that for 2 weeks, then you just got together with your local Anglican priest and you got married. Well, the problem was that there were people who were getting married. They were getting married in different parishes or away from that parish, or they were getting married in churches that were not Anglican. Or maybe they didn't want to wait 2 weeks. And so they passed a law in the 1800s that said if you want to not wait the 2 weeks, or if you want to get married in something other than the official state church, the Anglican church, then you can come down and pay and take a marriage license. In other words, we as the government will give you a license to marry in regard to something that was formerly illegal. I mean, it was illegal for you to get married outside the Anglican church, or it was legal for you to get married without waiting that two weeks. But we'll give you a license, and you can get married without having to wait, or you can marry someone else. And so they started to do that. In the United States of America, if you wanted to get married 150 years ago, 100 years ago, You didn't have to do anything. You just had to announce it and then have a ceremony. And you were married. You didn't have to go to the government, ask permission. You didn't have to take a blood test. You didn't have to do any of these things. You just simply announced it and got married. That's how they did it. But then the occasion arose in some of the states of the United States of America, it was against the law for a person to marry someone outside their race. In other words, a Caucasian couldn't marry an African American, or a Chinese person couldn't marry a Hispanic person. You know, that's how we would apply it today. There were laws that forbade marrying someone outside your race. Well, as views changed and time changed, they said, we got to make a provision for this. And so they began to say in various states, if you're marrying someone that's not of your race, we'll give you a license to do it. Not everybody had to have one. But if you were two different races, then you had to have a license. And what a license is just simply allowing you to do something that is technically illegal. I mean, the reason that you have a license to drive your car is because it's not legal to drive a car unless you have a government statement saying you can. Okay? Well, that's what a marriage license began to be. So marriages began to be licensed in various states. And so finally in 1923, less than 100 years ago, a law was passed in our country called the Uniform Marriage Act that said all the states have to abide by this basic set of principles, kind of a loose set of principles with regard to marriage licenses. So all the marriage licenses, all different states would be similar. And that was the first time that it was ever stated by law that a person had to have a marriage license. And actually it doesn't say you have to have one. It just simply says the states have to conform when they do marriage licenses to this skeleton. It was amended in 1973. That was my lifetime. 1973 was amended into the Uniform Marriage and Divorce Act, which basically just said all the states have to fit within the same principle. But do you know that up until these things started happening, you didn't have to go to the government and ask to be married? Do you know that even today you don't have to? Now, I'm not encouraging you guys to go around and get married without marriage license. I'm not one of the pastors that says I won't perform marriage if you have a state license. We did. We got married with a state license from the state of North Carolina. I'm not about just walking around the law or whatever is expected of us in the law in these matters. But let me maintain this principle. Let's be clear about this. Marriages are not made by the whim of government. When I officiate marriages to this day, you may have heard me say this and not noticed it. When I officiate this marriage, I say, at the pronouncement part, I say, let me think how I say it. Then by the authority vested in me by ordination as a minister of the gospel of Christ, I pronounce you man and wife. I don't say by the authority invested in me by the state of Idaho. A justice of the peace would have to say it that way. But my authority is by virtue of the fact that I've been ordained into the gospel ministry. Not because the state gave me the right to do it. Incidentally, at this point, let me say this. Churches do not make marriages either. Churches don't make marriages either. These guys were all married before there was a church. In fact, the church came long after government did. It came at Pentecost, 2,000 years 4,000 years later, 2,000 years later. It was a long time later. At the day of Pentecost, that's when the church came. Churches don't make people married. What is it that makes a marriage? Well, God makes marriages, but marriages, my friends, are this. Marriages are the solemn covenant of a man and a woman in a spiritual union before God. Why do we do it in churches, you say? Why do we do it in churches? Well, I think it should be done in churches. I really do. Because it is a spiritual union for God. And the church is a place that we worship God. We as believers believe this is a place where we meet together to worship God. And for us as believers, marriage is an act of worship. We understand that when we receive our spouse, we are receiving a personal gift of God. And we are committing with our spouse, our husband or wife, to serve God together. It is an act of worship. That's why we like to do it in churches. But do you have to do it in church to be a legitimate marriage? No. Does there have to be a pastor there to make it a biblical marriage? No. Do you have to have witnesses? No. It's just simply a covenant like Adam and Eve made before God, that together in spiritual union they will serve God. That's what the Bible teaches about marriage. Now, all of this that we've said here to this point, all of this bears on the homosexual marriage debate that's going on right now. In fact, we arrive at this passage today at a very momentous time in American history and world history, really. This last year, 2013, has seen an avalanche of victories from the homosexual wing of our culture, of our society. An avalanche of them. I was just back in December 20th, where a federal judge said that the Utah's prohibition of gay marriage was unconstitutional. It had been passed by the majority of the people in Utah, but the judge said, no, it's unconstitutional, it's out. And so Christmas time, just a couple weeks ago, many of the gays down in Utah, many of the homosexuals down there, they were joyously getting married for the first time. I want to tell you guys, this is huge. This is huge. We've seen a cascade over the last year, and now I think there's 16 states that now allow homosexual marriage to be performed within their borders. But Utah's huge, because Utah's voters said, we don't allow it. Utah predominantly is opposed to it, but the judge says it's going to be instituted. It's unconstitutional. You can't say it's not allowed. And so now it's going to the Supreme Court, and we're going to find out if the homosexual agenda will win in the state of Utah. If they win the state of Utah, I think it's over, quite frankly. I think it's over. But let me just deal with this issue here for a few moments. Let me say, first of all, homosexual people must be dealt with respect. Can I say that? We need to make sure that whenever we are dealing with this homosexual issue or that homosexual issue, or we are dealing with people who are homosexual, we deal with them with respect. That's how you love people who you don't know personally. You respect them as human beings. Okay? I know sometimes it's hard because there are some in the homosexual movement who are very angry and very loud and very vehement. And it's easy sometimes to react against their anger in ways that are not respectful. To be fair, sometimes they're acting that way because people that are on our side of the debate are also very angry and loud at them. But we must understand, God calls us to love all people, and the way we love people we don't know is we respect them as human beings. We should speak to them respectfully. We should hear them respectfully. We should answer questions respectfully. We should debate with them respectfully. But let's understand this. This is what I think we ought to understand. I want to deal with this very carefully. Let me say this. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know jurisprudence a lot. I am just a common man trying to think through these issues in a way that's informed by my Bible, by the Word of God. And I do think that the things I'm saying here today could certainly be built from case law by an intelligent lawyer. I think you could build these things. Here's my issue. Here's what I'm going to say to you. I'm opposed to gay marriage. But perhaps not for the reasons that you think. I'm opposed to gay marriage because here's the situation. Here's the facts of the matter. Marriage is not made by the government. And what that tells us is that marriage between homosexuals is already allowable in every single state of this country. In other words, they don't have to get a marriage license to go and find someone who will officiate a ceremony in which they pledge to each other before their concept of God or misconception of God and make a vow and become married. Okay? There's nothing stopping them from doing that. There used to be anti-sodomy laws, but those laws have by and large been wiped off the books. And if they're even on the books, they're no longer prosecuted. And quite frankly, I think that's good. I don't think it's any of my business what they do in their personal lives. If they want to go out and marry someone who's of the same gender, I say they've got the right to do it. If they want to marry their tree, they have the right to do it. If they want to marry their dog, they have the right to do it. I have the right to say it's wrong. Okay? They're free and I'm free. That's the way it is right now. In Idaho, if a homosexual couple wants to go out and find some liberal clergyman who'll perform a ceremony and they call themselves marriage, they're free to do so. Here's the issue. The government does not recognize it. The government does not recognize it in every state. And the question is, should the government recognize what everybody calls a marriage? That's the real question. Should the government recognize it? Now, if we lived in a society where there was a dictator or a king, it wouldn't really be an issue. Because the king might say, I recognize that homosexual marriage is a legitimate form of marriage, and we who disagree would simply say, well, that's the king, he's crazy. That's not us. That's the king's opinion. Not our opinion. That's the king's opinion. But here's the difficulty in the United States of America. We don't have a king or a dictator. We are a government of the people. It's a representative government. And so when the government says homosexuality is allowed, the government is pretending to speak for us. They're saying that we think it's allowed. So how do we handle these kind of issues in a representative form of government? How do we handle issues where people disagree? Because we do disagree. Well, we have a majority vote, right? That's how we handle it in a free country. We have a majority vote, and the majority says, this is what we say. So the majority says in Utah, we say homosexual marriage is prohibited in the state of Utah. That's how it works in a representative movement, in a representative government. The majority rules while the minority is protected to present their point of view and try to persuade people to their side. That's the way it ought to be. Okay? The majority rules while the minority is protected to defend and persuade people to their side. Okay? That's the way it ought to be. The problem with homosexual marriage by government today is this. The majority of people in our country do not agree that homosexual marriage is legitimate. We don't agree that it's legitimate. What is happening in places all across this country is that a judge is sitting on his powerful seat and saying, this is what you have to allow in your state. Majority rule be damned. And what are they doing by saying that? They're saying, we're going to force you to legitimize this marriage. We're going to force you to recognize a marriage that you don't say is legitimate. You see, the issue of homosexual marriage is not whether homosexuality is right or wrong. The issue is not whether they should get married or not. The issue is freedom for us to disagree. Now, if the point comes where our country shifts dramatically, and it appears to be doing so, and then the majority says in a state like Utah, it's okay to allow homosexual marriage, then we as the minority, and by the way, I'm always going to be on the minority. I'm always going to be on the side of the Bible on this. Homosexuality is wrong. We as the minority then will have to say, well, we're going to go along with the majority while we voice our dissent and try to persuade people to the other side. But you see, this is not what the homosexual lobby is doing. They're not out there saying, we're going to try to persuade people that homosexuality is okay. They're doing some of that. But what they're trying to do is saying, we're going to get the judges to force everybody to legitimize what we're doing. And in doing so, they're stripping away the freedoms of the majority of people in this country. That's what's happening. That's as clear as I can see it in my mind right now. Hey, if you want to, by the way, government recognition of marriage comes with tremendous privileges. That's why it's an issue. If government recognizes your marriage, then you can file your taxes jointly. You can file for survivor benefits from your insurance company if your spouse passes away. You have the right to go visit in the hospital. Some parts of the hospital, ICUs and stuff, don't let you in unless you're immediate family or clergy. And if you come in and say, well, that's my friend, they many times won't let you in. But if you come in and say, that's my husband and wife, they'll let you come in. So you can, legally you're married in the government side, so they have to let you in. There's a whole ton of privileges that come along with marriage. And that's why homosexual couples are pushing for it. It's not that they just want to be married. They can go get married, but they want the privileges that come along with it. And fine, I don't care if they want that. I don't care if the majority decides to give it to them. The point is, they should not force it on people against their conscience and against their freedom outside the way we are doing things in a representative government. Let me say this. I think our representative government is as close to a biblical model as you can find in the world. I think that's the way it ought to be in this world. But the point is, and we're in the middle of this, we're seeing a tidal shift in our country. It's not primarily or alarmingly most because it's a shift towards open expression of homosexuality, but because it's a shift away from free exercise of religion. That's the problem. That's the real problem. I hope I made myself clear enough on this. But the point that this all comes from is this. Government doesn't make marriages. Government recognizes them. The reason why the government recognizes heterosexual marriages between man and woman is because statistically everybody agrees that's legitimate marriage. There might be a 1% or a 0.5% or somebody out there who disagrees with that, but statistically everybody agrees that man and a woman married together is legitimate marriage. On the other hand, most people do not agree that homosexual marriages are legitimate marriage. And so this is a violation of freedom, is what it is. God does not make marriages. My wife and I are not married because we have a piece of paper saying we were allowed to do it in North Carolina. We are married because we together stood before God and said that we promised to each other and to our God that we would be faithful to each other till death do us part, that we would serve God together in sickness and health, and rich or poor, that we would together before God carry out the commandments that God has called us to carry out. That's what made us married. By the way, if there ever comes a time when it's illegal for us to get married, if the government ever becomes so oppressive, they say, well, you can't marry people. You can't get married if you're a Christian or if you're... And by the way, this has happened in history. You know what we do? We go out in the woods somewhere and we do it in secret. And it's still legitimate in God's eyes. Because as secret as it is, God was there. God was there. Marriage ought to be considered because it's sacred. It's sanctity. God makes it. We're going to carry out those thoughts a little farther next week. But let's just review here the reasons why we ought to consider the value of marriage. One, because of identity. Bone of bones and flesh of flesh. The women and the men are similar. God has made them so. Secondly, because of compatibility. They're also different in ways that work together. Male and female, God made them in the beginning. And thirdly, because of its sanctity. God brought the man to the woman. Marriage is a wonderful, wonderful thing. I hope it's not for you a drudgery or trouble or pain. I know it is for a lot of people. But I hope it is for you all that God means for it to be. It's not for everybody, but it's something we want to value and hold up, and everyone should consider it. And whether it's God's plan.